Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending, of course, on where you are. Thank you for joining Mayer Brown's Global Financial Markets teleconference series. Our call today is titled A Framework in Progress, Understanding the OCC's Draft Climate-Related Risk Management Principles. My name is Paul Forrester. I'm a partner in Mayer Brown's Chicago office and a member of the firm's banking and finance practice. Before beginning our presentation today, just a couple of housekeeping items. As regular GFM listeners know, our calls are recorded and we email an audio link to all participants so that if you wish to listen to the teleconference again or share it with colleagues, you're able to do so. In addition, the recording will be available as a podcast on your preferred podcast platform. In our GFM calls, we do not have Q&As, but we certainly encourage you, if you have questions regarding today's subject, to send them by email to gfm@mayerbrown.com, and we will respond promptly. By the way, that is the same email address as was included on your invitation emails. I'm delighted to welcome today Matthew Bisanz and Kerri Webb. Matt is a partner in our financial services regulatory and enforcement practice and is based in our Washington, D.C. office. Matt counsels U.S. and non-U.S. financial services firms on a variety of regulatory and compliance matters, transactions, and investigations. Kerri is an associate in our Washington, D.C. office and is also a member of our financial services regulatory and enforcement practice group. With those very brief introductions, I'm delighted now to introduce our speakers and to begin today's presentation. Matt.
Thanks, Paul. On December 16, 2021, the OCC released draft principles for managing exposures to climate-related financial risks. As we discussed late last year, over the past 3 decades, U.S. financial regulators have adopted a series of operational and governance standards for insured U.S. depository institutions, including specialized standards for safety and soundness at larger federally chartered banks. This is what the OCC is now extending through supervisory guidance to address climate change risks. Specifically, the climate principles from December are supervisory guidance that outlines a high-level framework for the management of exposures to climate-related financial risks. They draw heavily from the Basel Committee's proposed principles for climate risk management and the OCC's existing heightened standards for larger U.S. banks. However, unlike the 18 clearly defined principles in the Basel Committee's proposal, the OCC's climate principles are divided into 2 lengthy, meandering narratives that contain somewhat disjointed commentaries on risk management. While institutions generally should be familiar with the concepts because they come from the heightened standards applicable to large U.S. institutions, this particular approach may complicate efforts to translate the climate principles into an institution-specific action plan. Therefore, banks should spend time up front mapping the discrete expectations in the OCC's climate principles to existing risk management frameworks, possibly on a sentence-by-sentence basis. Additionally, notwithstanding the draft label, the OCC states that it will consider public feedback on the climate principles primarily in relation to developing new guidance in the future, and it asks several questions to that end that Kerri will cover later in the webinar. Therefore, it may be the case that the climate principles remain in draft form for a lengthy period of time, maybe forever, and are refined in a piecemeal fashion by subsequent issuances from the OCC. Alternatively, the agency may decide to issue a revised or final version of the principles, again at some unknown point in the future. More importantly, though, as indicated in the OCC's earlier call to action on climate change, this is an issue that the agency will be focusing on as it examines larger banks over the next year, regardless of the draft status. Therefore, OCC-regulated banks should consider updating their climate change processes and procedures to align with the OCC's current expectations, and then be ready to further revise their climate change management plans and action plans to incorporate additional guidance from the agency. I should mention at this point that the climate principles are targeted at larger OCC-regulated banks, which are defined as those with over $100 billion in total assets or that have material exposures to climate-related financial risks. However, smaller banks and banks that are not regulated by the OCC also might consider reviewing the climate principles to inform their own risk management activities. As we've seen over the last 5 or so years with heightened standards, the rules for the largest OCC-regulated banks have a way of being applied to some smaller banks or state-chartered banks by certain examiners looking for a metric or a framework. This is particularly true for state-chartered banks that have larger and more complex operations that may be associated with material exposures to climate-related financial risks. With that context, I will start talking about the governance and scenario analysis aspects of the climate principles. The climate principles describe actions that bank boards and management should take to demonstrate appropriate governance of climate-related financial risks. Many of these actions are focused on ensuring that the board and management obtain sufficient information on risks and risk management activities. For example, the OCC expects bank management to regularly report to the board on the level and nature of the institution's climate-related financial risks. A second theme of the governance-related principles is that the bank should assign appropriate responsibility and accountability for managing climate-related financial risks. This is consistent with the OCC's longstanding focus on clearly defining roles and responsibilities for risk management. In this case, it means that the board should provide credible challenge to management as part of its oversight function. Management should establish responsibilities and accountabilities for managing climate-related financial risk, and bank staff should be held accountable for controlling risks within their lines of authority and responsibility. The third theme in the climate principles is that the OCC expects climate change to have long-term consequences for banks, and therefore it further expects banks to have a comprehensive approach to managing climate-related financial risks. With respect to governance, the OCC indicates that this may mean assessing the potential impact of climate-related risks using a time horizon that is longer than a bank's typical planning horizon. It also means that banks should consider material climate-related financial risk exposures when setting the bank's overall strategy, risk appetite, and financial capital and operational plans. The OCC notes that the strategic planning process will be iterative with respect to incorporating material climate-related financial risks, and reminds banks that climate-related strategies must align with the bank's overall strategy and that risk management practices and actions must be consistent with the bank's public communications. It also notes that boards and management should consider the impact of climate change on a range of stakeholders as part of the strategic planning process, including the impact on low and moderate income customers and other disadvantaged households and communities. Climate-related scenario analysis is the forward-looking assessment of the potential impact on a bank of changes in the economy, financial system, or the distribution of physical hazards resulting from climate-related risks. It is a specific type of risk management practice, and the climate principles identify scenario analysis as a risk management practice of emerging importance. This is no surprise given the significant emphasis placed on scenario analysis in the OCC's earlier call to action in 2021. However, the climate principles seem to focus exclusively on the top-down approach to scenario analysis, which is similar to capital stress testing and focuses on the long-term effects of a scenario or potential change on the entire institution. This is in contrast to the call of action, which emphasized the importance of conducting both top-down and bottom-up analyses. And for those playing along at home, a bottom-up analysis asks more granular what-if questions and focuses on only parts of a bank's portfolio instead of the effect on the entire institution. The climate principles indicate that banks should develop their climate-related scenario analysis capabilities using the same approach that is used for other modeling activities. For example, they should consider sound model risk management practices and act in a manner that is commensurate with the institution's size, complexity, business activity, and risk profile. While expected from the agency, this approach appears to discount some of the benefits of relying on standardized approaches, such as the scenarios developed by the Network for Greening the Financial System, which U.S. regulators have repeatedly touted first in 2021 and through the present as something that they are joining and that they are looking into. The climate principles also do not indicate how the OCC's expectations for scenario analysis will align with the climate stress testing contemplated by the Federal Reserve. While we haven't heard much about the Federal Reserve's actions over the past few months, given the change in composition of the Board of Governors, it is expected to take a more prominent role later this year, and therefore it would be nice if the OCC and the Fed were to act together, or at least align their efforts in this very difficult and burdensome area for bank risk management practices. For more of this in-the-weeds analysis, I will turn things over to Kerri.
Thanks, Matt. As Matt mentioned, another major topic addressed in the climate principles is risk management. Under the proposed climate principles, banks are expected to identify, measure, monitor, and control financial risks posed by climate change. Perhaps most significantly, the climate principles expect bank management to ensure that climate-related risks are incorporated into the bank's existing risk management and internal control frameworks. Management is expected to oversee the development and implementation of comprehensive processes that will incorporate climate-related risks across all traditional risk categories, and that will utilize all of the bank's lines of defenses to mitigate those risks. The OCC expects banks to conduct a comprehensive review to identify climate-related risks. The climate principles direct banks to consider various scenarios and time horizons. In addition, banks should gather input from all relevant experts and stakeholders within the bank. The bank should clearly define any material risks and ensure that any exposures are aligned with the bank's risk appetite and supported by appropriate metrics and processes for escalation. The OCC identifies several tools and approaches a bank can use to assess both short-term and long-term climate-related risks. These tools include exposure analysis, heat maps, climate risk dashboards, and scenario analysis. These high expectations for addressing climate-related risks may require banks to make significant enhancement to their risk management activities. Banks may also need to develop new resources tailored specifically to address climate-related financial risk. Relatedly, the climate principles highlight the need for banks to use climate risk-related data. While the OCC states that it expects banks to aggregate and monitor climate risk-related data, there are currently no standardized taxonomies or risk databases for this type of data. As a result, some banks may need to develop new approaches for defining and collecting relevant information. Some stakeholders, such as members of the House Financial Services Committee, have raised concerns to the OCC about the lack of readily available climate risk data. The final part of the climate principle consists of a lengthy discussion on how climate-related financial risks can be addressed in the context of specific risk categories or stripes. This discussion largely covers the content of Principles 8, 9, 10, and 11 of the Basel Committee's proposal. Specifically, the climate principles cover how climate-related financial risks can be addressed in the areas of credit, liquidity, interest rate, operational, legal, compliance, and reputational risks. Regarding credit risk, the climate principles state that a bank's board and management should consider climate-related risks as a part of their underwriting and monitoring of portfolios. In addition, the OCC states that banks should determine credit risk appetite and lending limits related to climate risks. The OCC suggests that risk management practices could include monitoring climate-related credit risks through sectoral, geographic, and single-name concentration analyses, and banks should assess potential changes and correlations across the bank's exposures or asset classes. On the topic of liquidity risk, the OCC states that the board and management should assess whether climate-related financial risks could affect liquidity buffers, and if so, the bank should incorporate those risks into its liquidity risk management framework and liquidity buffers. Banks should also consider how climate-related financial risks may impact the bank's interest rate risk. Further, climate change may increase the bank's exposure to risk caused by changing prices. Banks should use the best measurement methodologies reasonably available at the time and continue to refine those methodologies over time. In addition, the OCC states that a bank's board and management should consider how climate-related risks may adversely impact the bank's operations, control environment, and operational resilience. Sound operational risk management includes incorporating an assessment across all business lines and operations, including third-party operations, and considering climate-related impacts on business continuity. The climate principles also provide that a bank should consider how climate-related risks and risk management measures may affect the legal and regulatory landscape, such as potential changes to legal requirements for flood or disaster-related insurance. In addition, banks must consider whether any climate risk mitigation efforts may disproportionately affect communities or households on a basis prohibited by fair lending laws. Attempts to mitigate climate change-related risks may disproportionately adversely impact low or moderate income communities, and these communities are the most vulnerable to impacts from climate change itself, as well as to policy and pricing changes to address climate change. Finally, a bank should consider the extent to which its activities may increase the risk of negative financial impacts due to reputational damage, liability, or litigation. The climate principles state that banks should view climate-related financial risks in the context of traditional risk categories. This statement appears to indicate that the OCC does not expect climate-related risks to be a standalone category in banks' risk taxonomies. This view is consistent with prior comments by the acting Comptroller that climate risk cannot be reduced to a single metric. However, this approach may lead to difficulties in assigning the impact of a climate-related risk event to different categories. In other words, this approach makes it difficult for banks to avoid double counting of the impacts of climate risks. The OCC styled the climate principles as being in draft form and requested feedback on them. As a reminder, the OCC will accept comments on the climate principles until February 14, 2022. In particular, the OCC has asked the following 13 questions of commenters. Are there additional categories of banks to which the climate principles should apply? Second, how could future guidance assist a bank in tailoring its climate-related financial risk management practices? Third, what challenges do banks face in incorporating these principles into their risk management systems? How should the OCC further engage with banks to understand those challenges? 4, what specific tools or strategies have banks used to successfully incorporate climate-related financial risks into their risk management frameworks? 5th, how do banks determine when climate-related financial risks are material and warrant greater than routine attention by the board and management? 6th, what time horizon do banks consider relevant when identifying and assessing the materiality of climate-related financial risks? 7th, what, if any, specific products, practices, and strategies do banks use to hedge, transfer, or mitigate climate-related financial risks? 8th, what, if any, climate-related financial products or services do banks offer to clients and customers? What risks, if any, do these products or services pose? 9th, how do banks currently consider the impacts of climate-related financial risk mitigation strategies and financial products on low and moderate income communities? 10th, what, if any, specific climate-related data, metrics, tools, and models from borrowers and other counterparties do banks need to identify, measure, monitor, and control their own climate-related financial risks? How do banks currently obtain this information? What gaps and other concerns are there with respect to these data, metrics, tools, or models? 11th, how could existing regulatory reporting requirements be augmented to better capture banks' exposure to climate-related financial risk? 12th, how do banks use climate scenario models, analysis, or tools, and what challenges do they face? And finally, what factors are most salient for the OCC to consider when designing and executing scenario analysis exercises? It is worth noting that the draft climate principles differ from the OCC's November call to action on climate change-related risk in that they emphasize different areas of focus for banks. For example, the November call to action emphasized business continuity and service provider risks. However, these risks are rarely mentioned in the climate principles. Instead, the climate principles focus on incorporating climate-related risk into a bank's governance and risk management structures. Given that banks already struggle with coordinating and prioritizing risk management burdens, hopefully, future guidance will provide a clearer picture of the OCC's priorities for climate-related risk management and a clearer path towards satisfying those priorities. And now, Paul will wrap up our discussion of the OCC's climate principles.
Matt, Kerri, thank you very much for that terrific overview. There's obviously a lot to digest in the OCC's draft principles, and I expect that you'll be receiving questions from our audience today. I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in, and as I mentioned at the outset, keep an eye out for the email with the link to the recording of today's call, as well as your favorite podcast platform. And as I just mentioned, if you have any questions regarding today's subject, please send them to us by email to the address gfm@mayorbrown.com, and we'll respond. Thank you again for your participation today. This concludes our presentation. You may all now disconnect.